He struck her first, not with a hand, but with humiliation. The parade ground shimmered under the cruel sun. 500 soldiers standing in formation, boots biting into the gravel. Sweat rolled down faces as the commanding sergeant paced before them, his voice sharp as metal. But when his eyes found her, the only woman among them, his tone turned colder. "Stand straight, Seal," he barked, his words cutting through the air like shrapnel. She didn't flinch. Her posture was perfect, every inch of her body trained to withstand storms far worse than this. But the smirk on his face carried something beyond authority. It was contempt. He moved closer, his boots grinding into the gravel with deliberate weight. "You think your medals make you equal? You think you earned that trident like the rest of us?" She didn't answer. She never did when dignity was on trial. Her silence was her rebellion. The men in formation tried not to look, but the tension bled through the ranks like the scent of blood before a battle. Everyone knew what was coming. The sergeant had been waiting for this moment for months, an excuse to break her publicly, to make a lesson of her existence. He circled her like a predator testing its prey. "Answer me, Lieutenant," he hissed. "Who told you you belong here?" Her jaw tightened. "No one," she said evenly. "I earned it." The simplicity of her words was gasoline on his pride. His voice rose, trembling not from rage, but from the realization that he was losing control in front of his own men. And then it happened. A swift, reckless motion. His leg snapped forward in a vicious kick, aimed at her ribs. Time seemed to stall. The gasp that rippled through the formation froze the air. But she moved first. Years of instinct condensed into a heartbeat. She caught his leg mid-air, her grip steel around his boot. A subtle twist, a pivot of her hips, an echo of 1,000 drills. The sound that followed was unforgettable. The crisp, shocking crack of bone. The sergeant collapsed, a strangled cry tearing through his throat as his leg buckled at an impossible angle. The crowd didn't move. No one even breathed. She stood over him, not triumphant, not cruel, just still. The dust swirled around her boots like the ghosts of every woman who had been told she didn't belong. Her eyes didn't waver from his face, but there was no anger there, only pity. The commander, watching from the reviewing stand, didn't shout. He simply stared at the spectacle, his mind torn between discipline and justice. Every soldier on that field would remember this moment, not because of the violence, but because it shattered something deeper, the unspoken hierarchy of respect. As medics rushed forward, the silence turned heavy, almost sacred. The men shifted uneasily, unsure whether to fear her or salute her. She turned away, her pulse steady, her expression unreadable. Inside, though, the storm raged, not of guilt, but of exhaustion. She had never wanted to prove herself through force. Yet every battle she'd fought, every test she'd survived, seemed to demand it. In the barracks that night, whispers filled the air. Some called her reckless, others called her brave, a few called her something far more dangerous, legend. But she sat alone in her quarters, unflinching beneath the dim light. The metallic scent of gun oil lingered in the air, mixed with the faint tang of antiseptic from the infirmary next door. She had broken a man's leg today, but not out of rage. It had been reflex, the trained muscle memory of survival. Still, she knew what tomorrow would bring. A summons, a tribunal, a reckoning, and yet beneath that awareness lay something else, an unwavering calm. Because deep down she knew she hadn't just defended herself, she had defended every woman who had ever stood alone in a room full of disbelief. Outside, the camp slept uneasily. The ocean whispered beyond the base, and the stars burned above like silent witnesses. In their cold light, her shadow stretched long across the concrete floor, unbroken, unyielding, and entirely her own. She whispered to herself, not in defiance but in quiet truth. "I'm a Navy SEAL, that's all that needs to be said." But the story was only beginning. Tomorrow, the entire chain of command would rise to decide her fate, and the weight of 500 eyes would follow her into judgment. Yet none of them, not even the generals, could foresee what that judgment would reveal about power, pride, and what true strength looks like when the world refuses to see it. Morning arrived without mercy. The sun lifted above the horizon like a judge pulling back his hood, revealing a light too bright, too honest. The base was awake long before dawn, and though no one spoke of it, everyone knew what day it was. The hearing. She woke before Reveille as she always did. The faint hum of the air conditioner, the rhythmic clatter of boots outside, the smell of sea salt drifting through the cracked window. Everything felt amplified, as though the world itself was holding its breath. She dressed in silence, every fold of her uniform perfectly pressed, every medal aligned with precision. She wasn't dressing for approval, she was dressing for war. Only this battle would be fought with words instead of fists. The walk to the tribunal felt endless. The hallway stretched like a corridor of judgment, lined with portraits of men who had worn their power like armor. Her boots echoed off the polished floor, each step steady, deliberate. The soldiers she passed gave short, uncertain nods, some in respect, others in fear. When she entered the hall, the murmur died instantly. At the far end sat 3 officers in starched uniforms, their expressions carved from stone. The sergeant she had floored the day before was absent, replaced by a thick silence that smelled faintly of antiseptic and pride. The presiding officer spoke first, his voice too calm to be kind. "Lieutenant Grace Hale," he began, reading her name as though it were evidence. "You stand before this tribunal to explain an act of violence against a superior officer during an official assembly. Do you have anything to say before we begin?" She lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes without flinching. "I acted in defense, sir." His pen paused mid-motion. He was unarmed. "He attacked first," she said evenly. "I responded according to training." That word, training, hung in the air like a blade. Everyone in the room knew what that meant. Training didn't discriminate by gender, by pride, by hierarchy. It was survival distilled into instinct. The commander beside him shifted uncomfortably. "You broke his leg, Lieutenant." She nodded. "I stopped him from breaking my ribs." The words were calm, factual, but they struck the table harder than any gavel could. Outside, the wind carried faint echoes of drills from the yard, the synchronized chants of 500 soldiers still moving under her shadow. The base had turned her act into legend overnight. Some called her a disgrace. Others whispered she was the first to stand up, not just as a soldier, but as something bigger, a mirror held up to the institution itself. The hearing continued. They read statements, dissected seconds, replayed the motion of her defense, as though valor could be quantified. But none of it touched her. She wasn't afraid of punishment. She feared only the story they'd write in her absence, the one that would erase the truth. When they asked if she regretted her actions, she hesitated. Regret was a word built for those who had choices. She had only reactions, instincts honed to keep her alive in deserts, oceans, and chaos. Still, she knew what they wanted to hear. "No," she said finally, "but I regret that he forced me to prove what I already earned." A ripple moved through the panel. The senior officer, an older man with medals dulled by years, studied her face with something almost like empathy. He had seen this kind of courage before. Quiet, patient, sharpened by cruelty rather than pride. When they dismissed her to deliberate, she stepped outside, into sunlight so harsh it burned her eyes. The parade ground stretched before her again, empty now, silent except for the cry of gulls overhead. It was the same ground where everything had changed, a place soaked in memory and dust. She could still feel the weight of that moment, the split second when instinct overrode doubt. It haunted her not because of what she did, but because of what it revealed, how thin the line was between defense and rebellion. She sat on the bleachers, watching the horizon. Her thoughts drifted back to the first day she'd arrived at Bud's training. Months of endless cold drills that broke bodies and spirits alike. She had seen men twice her size crumble, weeping into their own exhaustion. She never had that luxury. To quit was to prove them right. Now, years later, she realized she had never stopped proving them wrong. Inside the hall, the tribunal's voices rose and fell, the sound muffled but tense. She could imagine their arguments, the politics, the fear of setting a precedent. But she also knew something had shifted irreversibly. For the first time, they weren't questioning whether she belonged. They were questioning why anyone had ever doubted it. When the door finally opened, the presiding officer called her name. Her heartbeat didn't change. She stood, straightened her uniform, and walked back into the storm. The verdict would not define her, but what it revealed about the world around her, about who stood beside her and who turned away, would. And deep down, beneath the steel and silence, she already sensed that this day was not an ending at all. It was the beginning of a reckoning that would ripple through the entire base. And far beyond, the room was heavy with silence when she returned. The tribunal's 3 officers sat unmoving, the papers before them now less like documents and more like weapons. Every breath in that room carried the weight of careers, politics, and pride. The presiding officer's gaze fixed on her with the stillness of someone standing at the edge of a moral cliff. "Lieutenant Grace Hale," he began, his voice measured. "This tribunal has reached a decision." A pause, long enough to stretch across her ribs like a vice. "Your actions on the parade ground were a direct violation of protocol. Every soldier listening in the corridor beyond 10. But this court also recognizes the immediate provocation, the threat, and the lack of professionalism displayed by Sergeant Alcott." His tone softened, almost imperceptibly. "Your reflex was one of defense, not aggression. Therefore, no disciplinary action will be taken." The air left the room like a collective exhale. Grace didn't move. Relief wasn't in her nature. Composure was. She saluted crisply. "Understood, sir," but before she turned, the older commander who had studied her earlier spoke. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "be aware. This decision doesn't mean the fight is over. It means it's only begun." She met his eyes. There was no fear there, only the grim recognition of truth. Outside, word spread through the base faster than radio waves. The woman who broke a man's leg and walked away unpunished. To some, she was a symbol of everything wrong with modern warfare, a dilution of tradition. To others, she was the embodiment of what it meant to be a SEAL. Strength with restraint, loyalty with conscience. When she stepped back onto the training field, the world seemed to pause. Rows of men watched her silently. Some looked away uneasy. Others held her gaze almost proud. But it was the youngest among them, a recruit with shaking hands, who broke the silence. He saluted first. One by one, the rest followed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't grand. It was quiet, deliberate, and real. The salute spread like a slow wave through the formation, until 500 soldiers stood in perfect unison. The sound of boots striking the gravel rang like a heartbeat, steady and absolute. Grace didn't smile. She didn't bow. She simply returned the salute, her arm cutting through the sunlight like a blade of clarity. That night, she walked alone by the shoreline behind the base, where the Pacific whispered secrets only the sleepless could hear. The waves rolled in, glimmering under the pale glow of moonlight, and the salt wind stung her face like memory. She thought of the sergeant, of how anger had devoured him until there was nothing left but spite, of how easily that same bitterness could have consumed her, too, if she'd let it. The line between strength and vengeance was razor-thin, and she'd stood on it without slipping. The ocean hissed against the rocks, a steady rhythm beneath her thoughts. She had survived worse, missions that bled men into sand, nights so cold the ocean itself felt alive against her lungs. Yet somehow this moment felt heavier, because physical battles end, moral ones echo. As the tide rose, she knelt and ran her fingers through the surf. Her reflection wavered, half shadow, half light. She had carried the weight of proving herself for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist, to not defend her place, to not be the exception. Behind her, footsteps approached. She didn't turn. She recognized the gate, the old commander. He stood beside her, hands behind his back, watching the waves crash. For a long time neither spoke. Finally he said, "You changed something today. Maybe not the whole system, but something." She kept her eyes on the water. "Change doesn't happen in silence." He nodded. "No, but it begins there." When he left, she stayed, watching until the horizon blurred into the first hint of dawn. Her thoughts drifted toward the men who had saluted her, not out of pity, but respect. That was the quiet victory she had never sought, yet somehow earned. Still, she knew the world outside that base would twist the story. Newspapers, online threads, whisper networks. Half of them would call her a hero, half a liability, but she didn't belong to their noise anymore. Her battle wasn't for approval, it was for truth. By sunrise, she was already on the training field again, running drills, her boots pounding against the dirt. Each breath burned, each repetition a reaffirmation of who she was, not because she was allowed to be here, but because she had earned it, bled for it, and refused to yield it. As she climbed the rope tower, the recruits below watched in awe. Her movements were fluid, disciplined, unrelenting. She reached the top, turned toward the horizon, and stood tall, her silhouette cutting against the dawn like a promise carved into sky. And though no one heard her, she whispered again into the morning air, "I'm a Navy SEAL, not an apology, not defiance, just truth." What she didn't yet know was that the very system that had tried to break her would soon come to rely on her more than anyone. A storm was coming, a mission that would test not her strength, but her mercy. And when it arrived, the world would learn that the woman who broke a man's leg to defend herself could also save lives in silence, with the same precision, the same unshakable calm. 3 months passed before the call came. The night was calm when it arrived. No warning, no prelude, just the shrill ring of a secure line cutting through the barracks silence. Grace had been awake, sitting at her desk, polishing her sidearm with the slow precision of ritual. She picked up the receiver before the second ring. "Lieutenant Hale," came the voice on the other end. "We have an operation. Classified, immediate deployment." Those words, cold and mechanical, carried something she hadn't heard in weeks, purpose. By dawn, she was standing on the airstrip, gear packed, rifle slung, the roar of a helicopter rolling through the salt-heavy wind. The mission brief was thin, too thin for comfort. A downed surveillance drone in hostile territory, possible capture of encrypted data, enemy movement in the area. Extraction required stealth, speed, and absolute precision, no room for error, no time for doubt. Her team assembled quietly, 6 men who'd trained beside her for years. None spoke of the tribunal, none spoke of the past. In the silence between them was trust, the kind that isn't earned through speeches, only through shared survival. When the helicopter lifted into the sky, the base vanished beneath them, a blur of grey and steel swallowed by cloud. Grace watched it disappear and felt, for the first time, a sense of distance from everything that had nearly consumed her. Hours later, they landed deep in mountainous terrain. The air was thin, the night black and endless. Snow crunched beneath their boots, muffled under layers of discipline and breath. Grace moved at point, her senses sharpened by the rhythm of danger. Every sound mattered, every silence meant more. They found the wreckage at dawn, a twisted mass of steel wedged into a ravine, smoke still whispering from its core, but they weren't alone. The enemy had arrived first. Gunfire erupted before the first order could be spoken. The valley became a storm of sound and motion, muzzle flashes tearing through the fog. Grace dove behind the wreckage, returning fire with mechanical calm. One of her men fell, a shout swallowed by chaos, and something cold and ancient surged through her veins. It wasn't anger, it was purpose. She moved low and fast, flanking through the rocks, her breath measured, her body memory carrying her farther than thought ever could. One by one she silenced the resistance, each shot placed with surgical precision. The last man fell with a cry that echoed off the mountains, leaving only the sound of wind and the heartbeat in her ears. When it ended, silence reclaimed the world. Her hands were steady as she retrieved the encrypted core from the wreckage, but her heart felt heavier than it should have. Another life gone. Another ghost added to the long list that followed her through every mission. They extracted before nightfall. The helicopter blades cut the dusk like a hymn. She sat in silence on the flight back, blood on her gloves, wind biting through the open hatch. No one spoke. They didn't need to. When they landed, the commander was waiting on the tarmac, the same man who had watched her trial from behind the tribunal table. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes carried a weight that told her everything. "You brought them home," he said quietly. She nodded once. "See?" She nodded once. "Most of them," he hesitated. "You saved the mission. And your team," Grace looked past him, toward the sea where the horizon bled into twilight. "That's the job." He studied her for a long moment, then said, "The sergeant you defended yourself against, he's requesting to see you." For the first time, her composure cracked. Just slightly, she went. The infirmary smelled of antiseptic and quiet regret. The man who had once tried to humiliate her now sat in a wheelchair, his leg bound in metal and leather. His face was older, softer, not with age, but with understanding. When he looked up, the arrogance was gone. "I heard about the mission," he said. His voice trembled, stripped of rank and armor. "You saved them. All of them." "Not all," she corrected. He nodded slowly. "Still more than I ever did." Silence settled between them. It wasn't awkward. It was human. It was human. Finally, he said, "I was wrong, Lieutenant. You didn't have to prove anything. I just wasn't ready to see it." Grace didn't answer. She simply reached out and rested her hand on his shoulder. A gesture so small, it carried the weight of every unspoken apology in the world. Then she turned and walked away. Outside, the base was alive again. Drills, orders, the hum of routine. But something intangible had shifted. Men who once avoided her now nodded with quiet respect. Young recruits whispered her name not as gossip, but as a story that meant something. That evening, she stood on the same parade ground where it had all begun. The setting sun painted everything gold, the same dust swirling around her boots. 500 soldiers stood at attention. The new commander, none other than the old man who had seen her truth from the beginning, called her name. She stepped forward, for valor, he said, for restraint, and for the courage to defend honor, not ego. "Lieutenant Grace Hale, you have our respect." Applause rippled through the ranks. Not the chaotic clamor of celebration, but a steady rhythm of reverence. Grace saluted once more, her face unreadable, her heart steady. As the sound faded, she looked to the horizon. The sun was sinking into the sea, burning itself into the water, like a promise of rebirth. And in that fading light, she felt something she hadn't in years. Not victory, not vindication, but peace. Because the world had finally seen her not as an exception, but as a soldier. She turned to leave, the wind lifting the edge of her uniform, carrying her whisper across the field. Soft, steady, and certain. "I'm a Navy SEAL," and this time she didn't have to prove it.